Hello, and welcome back to the Argyle Finance Solution Summit. My name is Brittany Sullivan with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our esteemed speakers. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which includes complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. To ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat, and we will address your questions at the end of the session. Now, without further delay, I would like to introduce our speakers, Josh Gersh, Senior Industry Principal at Workiva, Mark Mellon, Industry Principal at Workiva, and Nipa Pandya, Solution Engineer at Workiva. We're excited to have Josh, Mark, and Nipa with us for a marketplace fireside chat and demo titled The Flywheel Effect of Unified ESG, Audit and Risk, and Financial Reporting. Welcome all, and over to you.
Welcome, everybody. Happy to be here with you today to talk about the flywheel effect of unified ESG, audit and risk, and financial reporting. My name is Mark Mellon. I'm an industry principal at Workiva. Through that, I support our teams in sales, marketing, product, and other teams as we evolve our product and platform, including our messaging in the marketplace as it relates to ESG, financial reporting, and GRC. With me today are Nipa Pandya and Josh Gersh. I'll let them both introduce themselves.
Thanks, Mark. And I'm also with Workiva here in the Growth Solutions team that supports the testing and evaluating of new solutions in the market. As you know, the dynamic of customer demands change. My professional experience here has been heavy in the internal audit function around leading SOX compliance in the past, advisory audits, ESG assurance, and operational audits. So I'm looking forward with sharing a perspective on current industry trends and some challenges today. And I will hand it over to Josh there.
Yeah, thanks, Nipa. Josh Gersh, as I mentioned, I'm a senior industry principal here at Workiva. I have a background as a former practitioner in the accounting and finance space. So I spent a number of years in with KPMG in their audit practice, focused on financial reporting matters. And then I've held a number of positions, director of accounting, controllerships, where I've kind of overseen financial reporting. So I work here at Workiva to kind of lend practitioner experience to all that we do here, or try and make our products better to kind of serve that audience. So again, happy to kind of, as things have continued to roll out with ESG and other things, happy to provide a perspective on, how financial reporting, ESG, and all these things are starting to come together more and more.
Great. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate everybody being here today and look forward to the conversation we'll have as we walk through the discussion today. So as we move forward in the presentation, why are we talking about ESG so much? Why is it in so much of a focus and really driving the intersection and integration across GRC and financial reporting? And you'll see 4 pillars that we're displaying here. And this is probably just a sampling. There may be other things that are on your mind as you think about ESG and how it impacts your organization. But from a regulatory angle, we obviously have a lot of activity here in the US and around the world, whether it be the SEC's climate proposal, potential proposals around human capital disclosures and cybersecurity disclosures in the EU with the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. Many other similar climate disclosure proposals aligned to the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, also in other parts of the world. We've also obviously seen an increase in heightened investor expectations, whether that be through some of the largest asset managers in the world like BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, and others, whether that be through banks evaluating organizations' ESG performance as they think about preferential rates of capital lending, or private equity and driving greater return on companies that are purchased and then sold or taken public. We also think about a broad array of stakeholders, and not just shareholders, obviously on the investor side, but customers, employees, and other supply chain or customer partners that are driving companies to focus on ESG and on it in a much more rigorous and robust manner. And I think finally, it's worth mentioning just the continued competition among corporates and corporates within an industry or corporates across industries, just sort of racing to be best in class, whether that be around their net zero commitments, around their diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging commitments. We see a lot of that competition driving that increased focus around ESG and the attention to making ESG much more integrated within the business. So some additional kind of timeline view on what's driving that intersection when we think about especially sustainability or ESG reporting, as well as financial reporting. And we've seen since 2017 with the NFRD or non-financial reporting directive in Europe, a drive to bring together financial and ESG or sustainability reporting. And you can see as we look toward the horizon, we see things that exist today like the EU taxonomy, TCFD aligned disclosure, CSRD disclosure that we mentioned initially, which aligns with the European Sustainability Reporting Standards or ESRS, the SEC's obvious focus on ESG related matters, and the IFRS or International Financial Reporting Standards and their International Sustainability Standards Board, which was obviously formerly known as the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board or SASB. And what a lot of this sort of drive toward the integration of these two areas is bringing is the need for automated technology and data capture to understand where that information is coming from. So organizations have better confidence in how that information is being managed within the business and that it's right when it goes out the door. That also requires the ability to collaborate amongst teams, which are much more widespread throughout the organization than maybe we have seen historically with financial reporting, widespread that is on the ESG side. Similarly, you're starting to see these teams being assembled within organizations to help and stand up controls and processes to enable assurance, whether that's initially internal assurance or external assurance, which many companies have already obtained, even if that may be on a smaller scope of their ESG disclosures. We still see a lot of that going on. Similarly, as we think about the sharing of disclosures across these two channels, we've seen probably a proliferation of ESG disclosure being placed within an annual report, within proxy statements, and similarly on the ESG side, when the ESG disclosures are made, typically include financial information or information that was included in those annual reports. And it's really important that organizations keep those things consistent. If the number is supposed to be the same in one place as it is in the other, those types of checks and balances should really be in place to make sure that's the case. When we think about timeliness, obviously ESG, with the lack of regulation in the past, has been less of a timely exercise, which makes that information less decision useful for the stakeholders that need it. And the ability to roll that forward is still time consuming for organizations when we think about ESG, and relying on some processes that the financial reporting teams have employed for years is something that we see a lot of companies working towards, so they can make that timeline in terms of ESG reporting more aligned to that timeline they see within their financial reporting processes. We're also seeing a big push toward tagging disclosures with potential XBRL taxonomies and having that information available digitally and accessible in different ways, because some of those stakeholders, whether they're investors or customers or employees, may want information in different formats or through different avenues. So organizations are trying to innovate as they think about how they reach those audiences. So what does that all really look like today? Obviously, it can be potentially a little bit of a mess as we portray here on this slide. And it's not just related to ESG, it could be related to financial reporting and GRC or governance, risk and compliance, which could include internal audit, risk management, how an organization manages their policies, procedures, and controls. But again, all of these processes are really run by, in most organizations, separate teams, and they're working now to come together and share best practices, processes, and technology even to make these processes more collaborative, more connected, and making sure everybody's on the same page. So with that, I'd really like to turn this over to a little bit of a Q&A now, where we work with Josh and Nipa, and I'll start with Josh. Josh, why is ESG impacting the accounting and finance profession so significantly?
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And I think it's interesting when you think about ESG, you wouldn't expect it to actually impact. I mean, I think when you look at it from a 30,000 foot view, you wouldn't expect it to impact the accounting and finance industry as much as it is. ESG, when you kind of initially think about it, it's centered around strategy, it's centered around performance, kind of long-term initiatives. How are we going to be here in 20 years? Are we doing things right to kind of be here in 20 or 30 years? And so I think a lot of times when we first think about ESG, we don't really kind of make that immediate connection on how it could impact, financial reporting or, accounting and finance professionals and their jobs. What's interesting about ESG as you kind of dive into the next layers beneath it is that ESG has a lot of both direct and indirect impacts on, financial reporting that I think at first we kind of don't pick up in the beginning. An example of a direct impact is a lot of ESG matters involve kind of evaluating human resources, capital. Do we have the right people at the right areas? How are we using that workforce? And honestly, how do we pay for them? Like, what's their compensation? How do we recognize and measure that? Is that through stock options? Is that through, salaries? How do we incentivize it so that we're getting the best out of our folks? And so, just that example alone, there's a lot of disclosures in financial reporting around compensation, around the measurement of it, how to recognize it, and how to kind of properly discuss it in, both your financial reporting, your proxy, and all your other kind of investor related, reporting statements I have. So that's kind of an example of how there is a direct impact between ESG, factors and financial reporting. Another one, indirectly, I think ESG can impact, the financial statements in other ways. If you are a company that for whatever reason has some negative impact to the environment, or there's damages for something that may have been, that may have happened, all of a sudden you could have a reduction in sales that might impact things. And so you think well, that doesn't really drive financial reporting. Well, it actually does over time, because you have that reduction in sales. Okay, maybe I'm going to look at my impairment analysis this quarter. And if I have that reduction in sales, is that going to actually drive the need to recognize an impairment? Or is that decline going to be something that's going to continue forward for a lot of years? So I think, as we kind of get into ESG more and more, we realize that there are these direct and indirect correlations between financial reporting and kind of those sustainability initiatives. I think this ESG movement has taught us that investors are not just okay with financial statement numbers anymore. They need more. They want to see more of a comprehensive picture. They want to see more of the strategy and the initiatives that build into it. And so I think, more and more the final point I'll make here is I think it's inevitable that financial reporting and ESG reporting, it's inevitable that they're going to have to come together. And if they do, there's going to have to be that connection, and it's only going to continue to, put more pressure on that accounting and finance profession to kind of help address those needs.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Josh. Really appreciate that perspective. And I'll really just toss it to Nipa now and ask really the same question in terms of how we see ESG impacting GRC or audit and risk professionals.
Yeah, thanks, Mark and Josh. Great context there from a financial and accounting perspective there. But as you think about the internal audit function or risk professionals, they are also in a great position to really be part of that evolution of ESG reporting risk. And commonly, these professionals are forward thinking, always proactive about emerging risk. Also, given the change in the regulatory landscape, as Mark had mentioned earlier, it certainly is very dynamic. And a lot of these organizations have risk or audit functions structured differently. But a common ask that you see today from the audit committee specifically is that investor grade quality data that's being published, and having assurance over that data as like a step one. So, for example, certainly the estimation that comes to calculate that metric, the actual alignment to the frameworks, but further, more so thinking about the interrelation to all the other public disclosures that are being issued and ensuring that consistency as we're hearing more and more of that, connection. But important to that is that, yes, the data quality, having that assured, as a priority is top of mind for a lot of auditors, and definitely impacting that in terms of their scope. But you can also look at it from that advisory lens of it too. So a common perspective in reviewing those metrics and providing a level of assurance there is also providing a perspective on how to build that control environment. But even thinking about it from a broader landscape on roles, responsibilities, or key processes that have been established in the financial reporting side, to really bring a best practice perspective there. But, certainly those risks are also intertwined, like you said, with the strategy and such. So bringing that lens of how can these risks can actually be bestly integrated into that ERM process is another advisory hat that internal auditors or risk professionals can play a role. So certainly impacting a lot of that. But another example here, Mark, is kind of thinking about also your audit plan for the year and how you're typically bringing in those emerging risks, but intertwining some of these risks across those audit programs as well. So as you think about those ESG topics and you take employee safety for example here, not only maybe you're considering that regulatory alignment and considerations there, but maybe some of those ESG considerations on top of that as you're thinking about broader context of making value add partnerships across the organization. So, as you think about this function, it really is playing a lot of different hats. And these are just a couple examples of how, certainly an audit professional can play a role here and how it's impacted today.
No, I think that's great. Thanks so much, Nipa. It's obvious, I think, at this point that the intersection of these three areas is really just going to continue to increase and require a lot more collaboration and connectivity between these teams. So it's great to hear those examples. Josh, I'm going to go back to you now. When we think about how we would staff these different initiatives, whether it's connectivity between ESG and controls or audit and risk, or connectivity between financial reporting and ESG, how do we find the people? How do we find the right people? And what are we seeing from teams in the marketplace when we're talking to our customers?
Yeah. And I think, I'm kind of here representing the accounting and finance professional side, or just, people putting together the financial reporting, the backbone to some of that. And I think we've joked about this in the past, Mark, but I think this is what is so frustrating. If you're sitting in an accounting and finance professional chair and having to look at ESG, is when it first came out, I think people thought like, oh, ESG, we'll put together sustainability teams. They'll run it. We'll just kind of make sure the numbers match and like everything, and we'll be good to go. We'll just support them a little bit, but they'll kind of run independent processes, independent reports, and we'll be good from there. And I think as this has continued to evolve, and given the demand that investors are saying, and the degree of confidence they want in those numbers, and that it all ties together, I think there's been a shift. Like I think there is a place for these sustainability teams, but more and more, I think the backbone of this is going to fall on the accounting and finance, professionals to support this. And the reason for that point of view is like, I'm not aware of any other profession that has the infrastructure to support what ESG is asking for. When you look at ESG, there are kind of some key areas that I think only those types of professionals can, provide the needed support for. One is reporting. I think ESG or sustainability teams can cover the reporting aspects, but I will say that accounting and finance professionals have been in that reporting space a long time. They understand how to build processes. They understand how to build cadence around that. They understand how to get reports out in different types of structures that either regulatory agencies or internal folks can understand and make decisions and interpret that data. And I think they're going to be highly leveraged in kind of building that connections to kind of keep everybody in the loop. I think in the accounting, like there's so much information that goes into ESG. Part of it's financial, part of it's non-financial, part of it's qualitative, part of it's quantitative. Really, accountants are kind of in the backbone. They've kind of built those systems to house data, to be able to manage data flow. And I think they're going to be called on again to kind of figure that out for ESG. Where do we get all this data? It's not all in the ERP system. There's a lot of systems we're going to have to leverage. How do we bring all that together? I think they're the most seasoned professionals at the moment that know how to do that, because they've had to do it before for financial reporting. ESG is going to have frameworks, and there's not an accountant out there that doesn't know how to deal with some kind of framework. Whether you're looking at the audit and risk side, you've got COSO frameworks and other things, or accounting has US GAAP, it has IFRS frameworks. So although the frameworks will be different, it's familiar territory that they'll be able to kind of look at it, understand it, and interpret it. And then I think the ultimate kicker here that makes me think that ultimately it's just going to fall in this profession is that investors are going to require a degree of assurance on this, which means that someone is going to have to review it and provide and going to have to opine on it as to, that there's a high degree of confidence in that information being put out there to the public. And, sustainability does not have that backbone of auditors, advisory firms that can do that. And so ultimately, I think that's going to kind of push it that way. The challenge, I will say, with relying or putting that pressure more and more on those accounting and finance professionals is that there's a real shortage of resources in that space at the moment. We are experiencing a time where enrollment is down in the industry. A lot of the expertise is retiring. And so we have this movement from investors where they're kind of pushing more and more and they want all these things. And you have this movement in accounting where less and less people want to do it. So there's going to have to be some kind of meeting of the minds there. I'm not sure what that is. And to some point, maybe technology, I think technology will play a role in that. I think about like designing well-oiled processes will have to come into fame. We're going to have to be really efficient at how we do this if we're going to do it right. But there's going to have to be some other levelers to pull because we just can't push it on that industry. I don't think we have the backbone, or not the backbone, but the resourcing for it. But all roads in my mind are kind of leading that way, honestly. So I think there's some challenges with it, but that's where I think it's ultimately heading.
No, that's great. So there's unfortunately a shortage of resources, not just in the world of ESG and sustainability, but also in the world of accounting and finance. So making things as efficient as possible is going to be incredibly important. You also brought up this idea of frameworks and standards. And, if you've been in the space, the ESG and sustainability space over a decade or so, like myself, maybe a little bit of a favorite topic or maybe the least favorite topic, like to refer to those as the alphabet soup of ESG. But there's not just the ESG frameworks when we think about frameworks and standards, but you sort of alluded to this, the control frameworks, things like the COSO framework or the Integrated Enterprise Risk Management framework, also from COSO. So maybe if I can go back to NEPA, how can teams think about managing all of these different frameworks and standards and bringing this reporting together under this kind of multiple array of frameworks and standards? Because as Josh alluded to, even on the financial accounting side, you have IFRS, you have US GAAP. On the ESG side, we've got ISSB and the ESRS. Plus, we've got to bring it all together with a little bit of a COSO blanket, if I should say.
Yeah, no, absolutely. thinking about the multitude of all those frameworks coming together, but also those data points. That's a huge undertaking, like was mentioned, and there is a significant collaboration that brings together the right teams, business units to build a robust process to execute something like this that's quite large and in capacity. When you think about ESG, it's not done by one person, it's done by multiple teams. And just by thinking about this comprehensive reporting approach, it starts with that sound governance of establishing a framework and having the right skill sets and key players that will take you to that next level. And for instance, your materiality assessment will serve as a purpose to identify those key pillars, to identify which ones are material in terms of what teams you need to bring in from HR, EH&S, etc. But not to forget the financial and accounting team as well, as they're prepared to align to key regulations on a day in and day standpoint. So for them to be part of this pod, you would call it a working team or a diverse skill set of members that are coming together from different departments to bring that expertise. And certainly each individual, each function is coming to the table with some sort of lens there, along with your audit function that's going to bring a perspective on what makes sense from a material standpoint to build potential controls down the line and how to frame that up, as assurance gets mandated down the line. But not to forget, some of those other members as well, like an investor relations team who's been accustomed to talk to investors for years and respond to responses to questions that may come as this ESG disclosure gets published. So there's a lot of different teams that make sense in this world of ESG to come together and kind of sit together from a pod perspective to work together and leverage best practices. As efficiency is key, like you said, from the shortages of, auditors as well, but also from the financial an accounting perspective, that process that you establish from top to bottom is one step closer to getting the right data validated, insured, documented, all the way down to that leadership that's kind of holding that ground as well. But one thing I just want to mention here, and it's sometimes overlooked here, is also that cultural integration and education. So with that core working team, bringing together education on what ESG is to your internal stakeholders is also very much critical and important to kind of define like that approach to meeting those objectives and goals down the line as well.
No, I love that last point. I think I've heard the need for change management in this space maybe more than anything lately, just in terms of how organizations are evolving in this space, bringing different teams to the table, and that part about educating them through a ideally well-defined change management process should hopefully benefit everybody. Josh, I'm going to turn back to you and revisit kind of the role accounting has played in ESG reporting so far and how you see that role potentially evolving. Just give us some high levels in terms of, typical examples of what that might have looked like to date.
Yeah. And let's all, I have to laugh because we all think, ESG has definitely gained some momentum in the last 3 years. It's been on everybody's mind, and you can't wake up and not pick up something in the news about ESG. But what's funny to me is ESG has been around since the early 90s, so it's not a new concept. And I think along that lines, as it's matured, so has the role of accounting, along with it. I think in the early phases, early days of ESG, it was just more about, hey, can we kind of have this long-term thing? Here's our report on it. And I think accountants kind of just help put that report together, we gave some insight on it. Here's our sustainability. It was pretty short and simple. Let's just let's put something out there someone can digest and at least just know high level what we're doing. I think as that's evolved, especially, more, I'd say in the last 5 years, as this has become bigger and that reporting has gotten more comprehensive, is then they've started to look at more of the process aspect. And I think accounting, that's where in the past we might have just been helping put together a report. Well, now we're in the weeds of it. How do we get the data? How do we get data from A to B? How do we gather it? What's the data preparation we need for this report? What's the cadence of putting that report together? What's the process of this whole thing? Who's doing what? Who's quarterbacking it, or who's on first, or who's kind of running it. I think a little bit more they were involved in that. And, so to evolve from at first, let's just get something out there, to two, okay, we need a process around this. Let's dive in. Let's figure out what everyone's doing. We're going to play this role great. Where now, I think kind of the final stages of it is like, one, there's probably more, I think accounting is playing more and more into that process and, taking on more responsibility there. But I think kind of future state, or where this ultimately goes, is I think accounting and finance professionals are going to be I think they're going to be, necessary advisors to the ESG strategy. I think they're going to be brought into, that strategic thought process on what ESG needs to be for a specific company. And they're going to be, a key stakeholder at that table. The one thing I think accountants sometimes get underestimated on is their understanding of the business, and how deep that goes, and how much knowledge they have of not only their business and what the numbers mean, but just that they are critical thinkers, that they do have to think about things from many different angles. And I think that they'll bring those insights to the table, and ultimately, they're going to be big developers or communicators of that ESG vision, not only internally to a company, but also to, those external investors that are kind of looking for that vision.
No, that's great. And as an accountant by background, but somebody who's been in the ESG space for a long time, I couldn't agree more. And Nipa, I know you used to be previously an internal auditor. What role did you play in ESG as an internal auditor at your prior organization? And how have you seen that evolve recently in your interactions with companies in the marketplace?
Yeah, Mark, in my prior company, I had an opportunity as a senior internal audit manager to build assurance around ESG. And it was a great opportunity for us to bring some value around this process in year one. And one thing, to highlight there as this journey started was that function was always recognizing the value of potential risks that were emerging and getting ahead of those risks. So being part of that early stage was very critical for that team to be involved in, as the ESG reporting cycle was also being, commenced. And with that, being said, that required a lot of partnership with the ESG core team in terms of communication, in terms of also some of the reporting metrics and mechanisms of reporting against those frameworks and how it was evolving. And as we previously mentioned, it was important to bring in a lot of those individuals that have core skill sets, like Josh had kind of alluded to as well on the financial reporting side. As this regulatory landscape was also evolving, that financial reporting team was so critical in that mix to be a joint partnership as we were figuring this out, together as a team. And our utmost priority initially definitely was the quality of that data, ensuring that data was complete and accurate prior to the release of that ESG report. But it was equally also important for us to think about future state at the same time, knowing that this was so new, that alignment on those key themes that we identified in year one really allowed us to be a partnership to evolve into the ESG team's core strategy for year 2 and year 3 on potentially helping them be a soundboard for guidance on governance controls or building a control environment, policies, procedures, and also accountability when it comes down to all those stakeholders that we mentioned that could be a player into this process. So as this journey kind of evolved here, we also kind of learned to kind of be lockstep in terms of coordination with the external audit team as well, and ensuring like where are we at in our process in ESG? Do you see significant gaps from where the regulatory and, landscape looks like? And that was important for us to also communicate where that risk was lying there to make some strategic changes if necessary. So I think what really worked well here is that the internal audit function was brought in from the inception in the beginning, and it really allowed more of that efficient model of that fast-paced dynamic of evolving risk to be more fluid as these changes were happening, and really have that open dialogue. And I think that's so critical as we think about this area of reporting.
No, thanks for that, Nipa. I totally agree. And one of the things that I'd maybe just point out, just to reiterate how important it is likely to reach out and connect with your external auditors if you're part of the internal audit team. If you haven't already, I think that's probably something that's occurred, especially for most of the largest public companies. But as we look at the horizon and the potential for additional ESG disclosures going into regulatory filings, whether that's an annual report, an SEC filing, or whatever it might be, that connectivity with your external auditor that may likely have to review that information or audit that information is going to be critical and continue to be even more critical as we move forward. So Josh, I'm going to go back to you this time. We don't currently have one set of mandatory comprehensive ESG reporting requirements today. How does that complicate the accountant's responsibilities?
This question, it reminds me when I was a little kid and I used to, be at the dinner table eating soup. And this probably is going to date how old I am, but there used to be soup that had like the alphabetical letters in it. So you could kind of play with your soup and bring words up. It kind of these frameworks kind of remind me of this. Like, it's just a big bowl of like alphabetical soup that's kind of out there at the moment. And, I think we're getting there. I think everyone recognizes that there needs to be some form of alignment and need for some uniform set of standards for ESG measurement and reporting. And I think we're definitely getting there. I mean, currently as it stands, there are a lot of frameworks out there, whether it's SASB or TCFD or GRI, or CBSD or CDSB, but there's a lot of them out there. And, basically I think the challenge with that has been, you've got all these frameworks out there, but if every time you're going from one company to another and they use a different framework, which I'm not saying is unacceptable, it's hard to get apples to apples a little bit, which is always what investors want to be able to do so that they can measure things and kind of evaluate their investments from that side. But apart from that, I think it's just, how do you build a process around something that can change? Because when you change frameworks and that changes data sets and that changes how you report on it or what you want to do or how you're going to audit or provide assurance on it, what's the challenging thing is rather than creating kind of one process where we can all go through and dive in, okay, ESG is a thing. It's going to go from A to Z. This is how we're going to do it. Auditors, this is how you're going to do it. I mean, I think the quicker we can kind of get to something like that, you'll see this come together a lot faster. But one of the challenges with ESG is that we've had so many different things. So we've got, all these different frameworks that have all these different processes. And I think that's all ultimately kind of lended itself to making implementing ESG. That's why it's been such a challenge to some degree. So I think a couple of good things looking forward, is that it looks like we're aligning more on a framework. There's some front runners right now. The ISSB, I think what they're doing is kind of going to provide a lot of foundation for that. But effectively, it complicates accountants' responsibilities because rather than kind of having one uniform set of standards and framework, we have 5 or 6 or 10. And that's incredibly hard to scale. That's incredibly hard to implement, integrate, and all that kind of stuff. So again, it's complicated now. I think I think the good thing is I think there's a path forward here, and I think we're going to get there in the next year or two. I think there's going to be a lot of alignment on that, uniformity that needs to be there. And once there is, I think you'll see kind of everybody double down on ESG and figure out what it's going to be and kind of move forward with it.
Yeah, as somebody who's seen the proliferation of frameworks and standards, it's nice to see a lot of coalescence around the TCFD through a lot of the regulation we see on the horizon, which really leads us into the next question for Nipa. which are, when we think about verifying or providing assurance either from an internal or external side, how are there challenges, or what are the challenges that exist when we think about ESG metrics, especially those that are disclosed in financial reports?
Yeah, I mean, great question there, Mark. And we just kind of touched on this a bit here as there's ESG is different. It's not like other forms of regulatory compliance efforts that many finance and accounting teams have been accustomed to do for years, such as SOX compliance, along with no standardization. So again, the non-standardization is obviously a big challenge today, but also the biggest component of ESG is the data. Now, the data here is coming from a lot of different unstructured sources or informal ways of bringing this together without, that typical accounting system that you've been used to from a systematic way for years. And, those financial transactions have been audited, reviewed, systematically processed for quite some time that feed into a cyclical life cycle. But now you're dealing with all these different data points coming from either a carbon accounting system or an EH&S system that haven't been assured, audited, reviewed. Also, just understanding the scope of that system in general is a new thing that comes into from a challenge perspective. But also bringing that together in a consolidated view is also significantly a big undertaking to see how do you piecemeal a lot of this information together. And as you learn more about that increases a lot of the stakeholders involved. So you're moving away from that bubble of finance and accounting individuals that are used to something for years and now expanding into operations, expanding into different business units that have to now be under the scrutiny of ESG. So, as I think about this, from both comparisons, given that, I've definitely seen the SOX compliance efforts and then the ESG side of it as well. You can see that this will be a cultural shock, as these assurance mandates come down the line here. And giving giving an example here is that we've validated some of this information from completeness and accuracy from an IT scope perspective for years on those ERPs that are pulling those financial data inputs, but from an ESG perspective, now we have to think about different mechanisms of controls for SOC 1, SOC 2s, potentially in those third party data that's coming in, or even so identifying the right stakeholders that are reviewing these data points for accuracy and alignment to these frameworks. So it's a very robust window of individuals involved, but it goes beyond what we're used to traditionally. And it really also think about it from an external standpoint there, as now you're not just touching financial stakeholders. Now you have customers, supplier networks that are using this data to make decisions and use this in their input. So it's really important that all these components come together, as you see these challenges.
Yeah, no, without a doubt, it's not easy, and I think one of the other things that just comes to my mind when I think about this is just some company defined metrics, and that almost complicates it further, and hopefully some of the regulatory pushes that are on the horizon will alleviate the need for some of that and the confusion around some of that. Josh, I'm going to turn it back to you, and when we think about some of the intersection of ESG data with financial data, we think about how organizations are trying to bring those together and trying to reconcile their financial reporting disclosures with some of the ESG data that they have. How are organizations bringing those together and thinking about maybe how ESG impacts their financial statements, especially as we think about things like the SEC climate proposal that may require them to do that?
Yeah, I think kind of three main things come to mind. And one is that there's got to be that consistency of quantitative information between ESG and financial reporting. And An example of that I allude back to would be, human capital or like our people resources. We're going to have to talk about compensation and things in both of those. And so there's got to be a one-for-one tie-in of, those numbers, those quantitative numbers that we're talking about. And I think that's pretty well understood. I don't think people would challenge that, or that people couldn't reconcile that kind of one for one in both ESG and financial reporting. From there, I think it gets a little bit more complex. I think the second thing I would call out is like disclosures are going to have to be more and more aligned. Like you cannot, when you speak to the market and you speak to investors, inconsistency is not really allowed, or it's only going to get you in trouble. So anything you disclose in financial reporting would need to be tied to ESG. There would need to be consistency or reconciliations there. It kind of reminds me, have this term in financial reporting called non-GAAP, where if you kind of speak outside the numbers, you kind of have to reconcile it back. And I do think that more and more there will have to be a reconciliation of disclosures, or if they're augmenting them further, there's kind of going to have to be that trail of, you stated something over here, you stated something further over here. Does it all make sense? And, that takes a little bit of thought and effort to bring together. And I think you're going to see more and more of that. And I think generally people are aligned with that one as well. I don't know that it's hard. That one's a harder one, but I think people could understand the need of speaking to that. I'd say the final one, which I think is the most challenging that people aren't really thinking about, is most of the scrutiny around financial reporting comes in only 2 or 3 areas, and it's where people have to make judgments about things. Most of the numbers are the numbers. Like if I buy a truck and for my company, it costs X, I disclose that in my financials. But if I'm out there making an acquisition, or I have intangibles and goodwill and other things like that, there's a lot of assumptions and judgments that go into that number. And more regulators are requiring that those be disclosed, and there be some insight on how you came up with those numbers, and that you followed a good process, that it makes sense. And I think, a lot of the narrative around ESG and a lot of narrative around those assumptions are going to have to be intertwined. And so, again, if you did something and you had a negative, environmental impact, or any other of the S or Gs that are out there, how is that going to play into those assumptions? How does that tie to like what you're thinking about? And that's going to be the complicated piece. And I think that's going to be the piece where I think most people are going to be concerned, or there's going to be an opportunity for regulators to probe at that a little bit more. So people are going to have to kind of make that connection. But I kind of see, those 3 things as the way we're going to have to kind of reconcile. We're going to have to reconcile kind of those financial things. Like the numbers need to match, the disclosures need to be consistent, and then kind of the underlying narrative of how you got there is going to have to be consistent, because if not, you're going to get tripped up on one or the other down the road eventually.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. And I think that last point, just in terms of the assumptions, is huge, because when we think back to some of the things we talked about in the beginning of this session, just in terms of the folks that have historically been involved in the ESG and sustainability reporting processes, haven't gone through those types of exercises before. And they're going to need the help of the financial reporting folks, as well as the audit and risk professionals, as they set about documenting some of those things. Nipa, I've got another question for you. When we think about kind of the linkage between risk management broadly within an organization and ESG, how do we think about those key linkages, and how they maybe drive value within the organization?
Yeah, Mark, when you think about risk management today and the building blocks of what we called as enterprise risk management, there's a clear linkage with ESG. And, one takeaway here is that leverage what's not broken within the organization. And if there is a well-established structure in place, weave in those ESG reporting risk into that broader landscape and really synergize that strategy telling, but also prioritizing those material risk across the organization. So as we know today that are risk professionals, that typically, those material risk embed some of those regulation noted elements, such as the EPA or even so the SEC. So now what you're seeing here is also reporting risk around those goals that are being disclosed on that ESG report, such as your net zero target or diversity goals that are being issued. So it's important to leverage what you have as a critical step, and weave those in by also assigning key accountability. So for example, for ERM, commonly you'll have a risk owner. Similar to ESG, you could leverage that step in identifying accountability and meeting those goals, those targets, as you're prioritizing in the larger context on what methods to monitor and prioritize from like a risk mitigation standpoint. So integrating that across, the organization's framework is one step closer to be, first of all, efficient, and also mirror that from a top-down perspective. But the other important thing is that transparency and monitoring of those risks on a fluid basis that you're seeing also in that TCFD disclosure, and how those are being managed and monitored. So you have that communication protocol already established there, and having those regular periodic reviews of that ESG materiality assessment, along with maybe key analytics, key risk indicators that let you evolve in implementing potential effective next steps. That could be new resources that you may need to execute something more effectively, or just more so top-down alignment. So you have that already established from a board perspective, and you're also leveraging key standards that are also built in, such as COSO, ERM, and your internal control frameworks that can be a huge advantage here as you're also aligning those risks across the organization. So again, we all know here today that, ESG is not a one-time process. It's a fluid process, just like ERM, and more that's going to be, very much combined effort there, as you see the two kind of mirror together.
Yeah, that's awesome. It really is a collaborative, kind of bidirectional process to involve those two teams and make sure they're both on the same page as they move forward. So I'm going to finally move forward to our last slide today, and really this is sort of our view on how Workiva and really technology broadly can support organizations as they work to make these processes more efficient, especially as we think about the integration of ESG across these other two areas, GRC or audit and risk, as well as financial reporting, and really helping organizations be more efficient by bringing together those sources of unstructured data that is where they're collecting this information, whether they're emailing somebody or emailing a third party even potentially. That's something that organizations are obviously looking to make more efficient, so somebody's not having to follow up nonstop with them. Additionally, even more efficient, connecting into some source systems, whether that's a finance system, an audit system, or an ESG system that has some source data that's relevant for a reporting output that ideally goes to one of those stakeholders on the right side of the slide here. And again, this is part of the challenge of organizations as they're thinking about satisfying the needs of these different stakeholder communities. They all consume information in different ways, and bringing all that kind of input or source information into one place, being able to have that controlled and managed and collaborated on in one place, have the ability for auditors to go in and look at what's been done and trace that back to the source, but also then use that to assemble those communications, whether they be reports or presentations that are delivered to those stakeholder audiences. I think we see as being pretty critical to making this process overall. And when we think about the integration of these three areas, GRC, ESG, and financial reporting, pretty exciting. So we really appreciate everybody joining us today. Hopefully you found this information useful in your work, and really appreciate Deepa and Josh joining as well to provide their perspectives based on their expertise, and greatly look forward to having more conversations with folks in the market. And good luck on your journeys to integrate these 3 areas, and reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you all so much for such an incredible session. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today. This session, along with all of today's content, will be made available on demand following the event.